I'm Lloyd, and I'm the author of The Story of Upfront Carbon. And this is a photograph from my book launch a couple of weeks ago. I did a small presentation there, and this is the information I sort of gave about the book at the time. Now, I start by explaining that for the last 50 years, we've always been worried about saving energy, and our building codes are all about energy, and we're talking about energy. But since 2015, we pivoted to worrying about carbon emissions as being the more significant issue. And they are not exactly the same. You have to deal with them differently. Now, the Paris Accord came up with numbers of how much carbon we could put into the atmosphere to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees or whatever the number is. And they concluded that to hit those numbers, we would have to cut our emissions in half by 2030. But the problem is that most people, or a lot of people, basically said, okay, we have till 2030 to worry about it. And that's not the way it was really going to be. What we have to recognize is that every ton, every pound, every gram of carbon emissions add to global warming now. Every ounce we add goes against the budget ceiling and adds to climate change. Now, with anything we make, there are two main kinds of carbon. There are the emissions that happen when we make something, usually called embodied carbon, and in things like buildings, cars, and computers, the carbon emitted while operating it. And together you get your total CO2 emissions. Now, I didn't really write this book for architects as much as people living normal lives because, while buildings and materials are responsible for 40% of emissions, we have to deal with the other 60% as well. We have to look at the entire picture because it's all connected. For instance, my Apple Watch only weighs 35 grams, but Apple says the life cycle emissions are 40 kilograms, and 85% of that is from making the thing. Now, people with carbon dioxide, they don't imagine it having weight because it's a gas, but it does. And I like to think about it in terms of anvils, because as we know, Acme anvils are heavy. So that watch of mine was 40 kilograms. Could you imagine putting this on your wrist and carrying it around? My phone is 80 kilograms. That's 2 anvils. Could you imagine having a 40-kilogram anvil in each of your pockets? No, it can't be done. But that's what happens. That's how much carbon was emitted in making the thing. Now, embodied carbon, it's a stupid name because it's not embodied. It's in the atmosphere. It's counter to the dictionary definition that embody means to include as part of something. I was in a Twitter debate with architect L. Ron Burrell 5 years ago when we were looking for a better name, and he came up with vomited or burped carbon. But we ended up settling on George Chappa's suggestion of upfront carbon emissions. I thought embodied carbon is still a city name, and I proposed let's rename embodied carbon to upfront carbon emissions. And George Chappa was part of a group putting together this book, bringing embodied carbon up front. The first time it was seen in a major publication, and it basically became part of the process of defining carbon, the making of it, and the building. Now, this is in buildings. You can see it called upfront carbon. Now, nobody gets this. They don't understand the upfront or embodied carbon. Hyundai, the car company, certainly doesn't get it. They put up an ad which said, why shouldn't a car have the same emissions as a bike? And the graffiti person came along and wrote on it, because of the carbon embodied in the materials. A car is very different from a bike. This kitchen company doesn't get it. Here's my most egregious demonstration of it. This ad that's located in Stefano Berri's Bosco Vertical, which everybody thinks is such a green building that even some people associate it with being affordable housing, even though it's likely the most expensive building in Milan. And nobody talks about how much concrete it took up to hold up all those trees in giant planters sticking out on huge cantilevers. And the kitchen is made out of glass and aluminum, essentially concentrated Upfront emissions. When Val Cucini complained about my post, they said, "Your grandchildren will use it. This kitchen will last 100 years. I told them, "I'm sorry, we have 10. It's why the World Green Building Council says we have to look at more closely at how we reduce our carbon emissions. And they suggest, what the first thing you have to do is decide, we'll build nothing. Can we do something else? We'll build less, reuse what we have. We'll build clever and optimize it, and we'll build efficiently. And I thought this was a great chart, but it goes for everything, not just buildings. We should at first try buy nothing, and then buy less, and then buy clever, and finally buy efficiently. Engineer Will Arnold of the Institute of Structural Engineers simplifies it down to 3 words that have become my mantra: use less stuff. Now, when I was at a conference this spring, I found that people were holding up these signs, the 2 key points to make better buildings: renewable energy and energy efficiency. And in my closed speech, which was closing the conference, I said, no, it's not enough. We have to have sufficiency. Critically important. You have to ask, do we need new space, or can we rebuild what we have? So you can see we've got renewables, yes, we've got efficiency, but we have sufficiency, avoiding demand for energy and materials. And to understand sufficiency, you've got to look at our sort of history. Take the 1960s American dream of the house, the car, and the boat. And look at the 2024 dream. It's the same, only it's a bigger house, it's a bigger car, it's a bigger boat. Or the 80 square meter, 800 square foot, 7 suburban house that was more than enough in the 1950s for families to aspire to. Now Elon Musk shows us his all-electric suburban house of the future, which has got solar electric shingles, solar photovoltaic shingles on the roof, a Tesla car in the garage, and, of course, a power wall on the wall. He calls it the future we want. But it's not a future that we can have. There's not enough lithium, there's not enough money, there's not enough land for such fantasies to scale. And as we know, electric cars still clog the roads. They don't solve all of our problems. My answer for sufficiency is what I do, which is almost all of the time ride an electric bike. It's a fraction of the material, uses 1/300th the amount of electricity as the car, and doesn't take up a lot of space on the road. It's sufficient for most of my jobs. Then I talk in the book about strategies for sufficiency. Now, in buildings, you may have heard about this, that more and more buildings are being made out of mass timber. But other people are looking at things like straw for insulation. And stone is making a comeback. In the UK especially, and France, people are building buildings out of structural stone instead of making fake stone out of concrete. We have to design for flexibility. For instance, this house that I visited outside of Toronto, which can be 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units, or even 4 units, just depending on how many kitchens they stick in and how they put the doors in place to divide it off. I love this example of creativity for flexibility in Berlin, where they converted an office building into an hotel simply by bringing in camper trailers. So you stay in your camper trailer, and just like at a campsite, you go to the common washrooms, which were the old office building washrooms in the middle. I always use this as an example, the old Volkswagen bus that could be a camper, could be storage, could be even a pickup truck. A simple box can do so much. And simplicity is the other principle that I think is so important. Good design is as little design as possible. And I use as an example my 2 ways of making coffee. I mean, you could take my fancy, expensive espresso machine where the grinder no longer works and the coffee thing doesn't get quite to the pressure that it used to. And you compare it to a $50 or $60 French press, which has been going for 40 years and still does the job and makes very good coffee. Satiety is a really important consideration. I showed this ridiculously huge media room by a lake somewhere, and my students all say, "Oh, I like that, I like that." But we can't do this anymore. It's important that we start to have discussions about what is the socially acceptable level of consumption. How much stuff do we need? How much energy do we need to consume to be happy and to be fair? Finally, I talk about a few items of stuff. I talk about the hamburger, and the hamburger's so interesting because we know that hamburgers, because they're red meat, have a very big carbon footprint, a lot of upfront carbon just from the meat. But in fact, that is almost outweighed and exceeded by the amount of carbon released by all the people lining up to get the hamburger, and the whole way our society is designed so that everything is drive here, pick up, take out, take home in cars that are getting bigger and bigger all the time. And so that, you can't look at the hamburger in isolation. You have to look at it in its context. I talk about the 2x4, this little modular element that we built North America out of, and that basically can build little houses, can build giant houses, and now can build apartment buildings. I even talk about the puffer jacket, which to me is the ultimate example of doing more with less. That basically a little bit of parachute cloth and a few feathers made the most effective jacket that anyone had ever seen on Mount Everest. And of course, I'll always to be talking about the question of the giant lifted pickup truck against the electric bike, and which is a better way and which is sufficient for our needs. And I always end with this photograph that could be, it's Stockholm in 1928, but it could be Portland or New York or Toronto or any modern city, which you can see people getting around by bicycle, by walking, by tram, and they're all going between relatively low buildings. It's enough. It's sufficient. And it is, I believe, the future. Thanks very much.